So this is the second part of our rundown on the history of Cyprus. It was perhaps in the third month of writing this script that I realised we might have overfaced ourselves with this one. Getting from the pre-pottery Neolithic to the Romans in the last episode was just about manageable because our knowledge of the ancient world is always going to be a bit fragmentary. But having already promised to do this in previous videos, we are now attempting to cover the time period that could easily be 4 or 5 videos into just the one. It means that we're going to have to be a lot more brief than I usually like to be, and we're mainly doing this through the lens of what there is still to see of the last 1500 years of history. The many historical sites you can visit in Cyprus that give us a window into the cultures that built them. So, beginning where we left off last time. We have a bad habit, particularly in England, of treating the 400s AD as a world-ending apocalypse. The Romans are leaving England, Rome itself is, quote, falling. And while it's true there was considerable unrest in Western Europe during this time, it ignores the fact that that wasn't the story everywhere. And in the eastern half of the Mediterranean, it was not without drama, sure, but particularly for Cyprus, not much more drama than the century following or the century previous. Locally, it appears that life carried on, for the most part, as normal. For Roman sites such as Curion, Paphos and Salamis, we don't have a huge wealth of information from this time in specific, and I'm not about to embark on a huge expose on the Eastern Roman Empire in general. That I am storing up for a huge Byzantine series that will come out in the far-flung future. I don't know, maybe if you're watching this back in a few years, a little thingy will ding in the top right corner. The biggest change you can see in the landscape is the churches being built. This huge basilica at Curion, it's a little hard to make out from the ground as it rarely survives at more than about waist height, but you soon realise this was a significant structure, getting on for 75 metres long and about that wide if you include the atrium and other structures abutting the main structure. Built in the 400s and expanded in the 500s, and there's still various elements you can see on the ground, including the baptistry and probably the most recognisable structure on the site, the surviving arches of the Diaconicon. In Paphos, there's a similarly impressive basilica. Now, this one is a bit harder to pass because this site is actually 4 churches from different eras. The ones we're currently concerned with have these later churches built on top of them. Also, the site was not actually open when I got there, so I had to just do my best taking shots around the perimeter. But you can see the vast mosaics that covered the floor, and you can see from this schematic here that following the expansion of the 500s, the original church almost tripled in size. These were huge building projects for the time and would have obviously involved considerable effort and expense to construct and decorate. Some more Byzantine church architecture from this era, the monastery of St. Barnabas has an incredibly early foundation date, potentially as early as 477 AD, with expansions in the mid-500s under Justinian. However, at some point during the Middle Ages, the monastery had been abandoned and become ruinous, and in the mid-1700s, some considerable restoration and reconstruction was done. So while the original structure may have looked somewhat like the current, I can't make any promises there. Just outside Larnaca in the small village of Kitty. Now this is quite something. The Church of the Virgin Mary, which has mosaics dating back to the 500s, which by the way is pretty unusual. We don't have many mosaics surviving from this era, especially not ecclesiastical ones. You can thank the iconoclasts for that. But there's a twist. The church structure you can see here dates from the 10 to 1100s. This apse was actually incorporated into the newer structure because the first church to house this apse with its mosaics was destroyed. But okay, you can't help but notice an ominous pattern of these once grand structures being destroyed, and we can't really keep the next bit of the story from you any longer. The island experienced raids from Arabic armies in about 649. Both Curion and Salamis had never fully recovered since the earthquakes of the late 300s AD. Both had been rebuilt on a smaller scale with some sections left in ruins, while the Arab raids led to these sites being abandoned entirely. This is actually where the story gets even more remarkable. You see, this pattern happened to many other islands in the Mediterranean for the next several hundred years. Malta, Crete, Sicily were all vulnerable to the rising Islamic powers on the Arabian and North African coasts. But what makes Cyprus so unique? In 688, Justinian II managed to negotiate an agreement with the Caliph Abd al-Malik that Cyprus would be jointly ruled as a condominium. Now, in the history of the various conflicts between the Byzantines and Islamic armies, this is highly unusual. Neither side was in a sharing mood when it came to conquests, And looking at the wider picture, it may be because after a failed siege of Constantinople by Muawiyah I, which caused him to expend huge amounts of resources in men and ships, the Umayyad dissolved into the Second Muslim Civil War, seeing huge upheaval across the caliphate. So being able to free up men and resources from Cyprus would have been a much-needed boost in the short term. But what is more surprising is that this agreement on Cyprus actually held. There's scarcely a pause in the fighting between the Umayyad, followed by the Abbasid, against the Byzantines in theatres all over, from Armenia to Carthage, but somehow the agreement to jointly rule the island remained. As with many of the early Islamic conquests in the Mediterranean, there is little to nothing to show you architecturally from this period. All Islamic architecture I could show you from Cyprus is later Ottoman stuff. Later attempts by the Byzantines to take the island back from around the 800s under Basil I were ultimately unsuccessful. But in 965 it was reconquered and made into a theme. For the uninitiated, that's a form of Byzantine regional administration. Now, amongst other things, the centuries of comparative isolation Cyprus had experienced from the rest of the empire contributed towards the unique Cypriot Greek dialect. Again, not as much as we'd like to show you from this era, though its architecture was shaped over so many different periods. The Church of St. Lazarus was founded between the 8 to 900s, and between the 12 to 1500s this Gothic portico was added. The bell tower is particularly striking, but sadly not particularly ancient. The original bell tower was destroyed by the Ottomans early in their years of control on the island, so this is a rebuild from around 1857. Among the ruins of Roman Paphos, the former Roman fort was bolstered by additional fortifications, nowadays not looking too healthy themselves. Known as the Fortress of the 40 Columns, most of what you're seeing are later additions in a part of the story we've not quite reached yet. In fact, virtually every fortification the Byzantines built or utilised would be augmented by later empires to the point of being unrecognisable. Case in point, we'll circle back to Kyrenia Castle when we talk about the Venetians, but you can see that these massive walls are very clearly designed with cannonballs in mind, and centuries later. However, buried within all of this is the Church of St. George. Now, before the Venetian fortifications absorbed it, this church would have been outside the Byzantine, later Frankish fortifications. It's from around the 1100s, and it's pretty magical. You reach it through a tunnel in the castle walls and you find yourself in a chamber with Corinthian columns and a high domed ceiling. It's a wonder this wasn't just demolished, and it must have been quite special for the largely Catholic Venetians to incorporate it within their expanded castle structure. We already mentioned the church at Kitty. That was rebuilt into the current form in the 10 to 1100s. The church of Ius Eustathius at Colossi is one from the 1100s. It's overlooked by the Frankish castle, and we're getting there, don't worry. But this is a survivor from before that time, though it received some modifications in the 1400s. There were rebellions in 1042 and 1092 by local governors on the island, but significant change was not until 1191, and it all happened rather suddenly. Richard I of England, well, Normandy really, landed on the island and came to blows with the governor Isaac Komnenos. It was a rather colourful episode en route to the Third Crusade. Richard was looking for his sister and fiancée, I should point out, two different women, thankfully, otherwise ew, after a storm had separated the fleet and wrecked some ships on Cyprus. Now, Isaac took both the women captive, which is perhaps not a great move, considering their brother and future husband had a large expeditionary force that had already taken a chunk of Sicily on their way to Palestine thanks to a spat with Tancred. So Richard took the Isle, which wasn't an original objective of the Crusades, so it left him in a bit of a funny position. He obviously wasn't going to just stay and rule personally. I mean, he'd barely spent much time on another obscure medieval island that he'd inherited as part of his holdings called England. And much like England, the idea was Richard would use Cyprus to supply his crusading expedition with taxes. But there were revolts on the island pretty quickly, so at essentially the first opportunity, he sold the island to the Knights Templar. However, they weren't able to quell the revolts either, so the Templars resold the island to Guy of Lusignan. All of this was the beginning of a very different chapter for Cyprus, one where it would be ruled by Western European powers. can't say this was a great thing for the local Cypriot population. Guy turned Cyprus into a feudal society, inviting barons from Palestine who'd lost land to Saladin to control large estates and use the local population as serfs. But while the remaining Crusader kingdoms in the Levant would soon dissolve and Frankish power in Byzantine holdings in Greece would rise and fall in the wake of the Fourth Crusade, Cyprus would remain as a unique fusion of Byzantine and Frankish cultures. You can see it in the church architecture from this time. Gothic arches alongside Byzantine apses. Now, the island of Cyprus was significant, but not exactly thriving. There's a succession of kings with less than flattering epithets, several being labelled the Fat, and in one example, the Pope describing John II as a vile, evil sloth. And not unlike many other Greek-speaking islands in this era, Cyprus became somewhat beholden to the conflict between the Venetians and Genoese, a topic far too huge to properly disentangle here. And while the Lusignan house would remain on the throne of Cyprus, they really weren't holding all the cards. Now, it's become clear that I've got way too many sites to fit in what is still supposed to be a summary video. We may have to circle back one day and do a separate video on Cyprus in this period, but a quick look at some of the castles on the island. The Byzantine fortifications at Kyrenia were expanded by the Lusignan in 1208 to 1211. You can still see some Gothic and earlier architecture in the courtyard, but we're still not ready to look at Kyrenia as it really only took its current shape when the Venetians get here. If you visit Cyprus, you can see a selection of comparatively diminutive castles that were built around this time to maintain local control. Limassol, I'm afraid we didn't actually make it to personally, so here's a pic. The location of Larnaca had been significant on Cyprus all the way back to the Bronze Age with the port of Kition. You can see that in the previous episode. But it was during the Kingdom of Cyprus that its fortifications got a significant upgrade to approximately what you see now if you ignore the minaret for a moment. This was sometime between 1382 to 1398. Over at Paphos, the Byzantine fortifications at the harbour had suffered significant damage in an earthquake in 1222, and it was remodelled under the Lusignan as well as some other structures which haven't survived. What you're seeing here is the Western Tower, which was built in the 1200s, but just bear in mind there's Venetian and then Ottoman additions to the structure as well. Finally, for now, Colossi Castle. Now, unlike the others, this hasn't been encroached on by a major city. In a form that more closely resembles like a stocky Norman keep, its original construction dates to the 1210s, although it had a major reconstruction in 1454 by the Hospitallers. Cyprus has two particularly spectacular Gothic cathedrals, though as it happens these are both on the northern side of the line these days, so if you're squinting at the minarets, yeah, no shock, those weren't part of the original plan. In Nicosia, you have what was formerly the St. Sophia Cathedral, now known as the Selimiye Camille. Had to film this through gritted teeth, not because I have a bee in my bonnet about its later conversion to a mosque, but nothing makes a shot ugly quite like scaffolding. And look, I know historic buildings need care and attention from time to time, but gosh darn it, if you couldn't just save that till about 5 minutes after I've got decent coverage, that'd be great, thanks. We think the foundation stone of this structure was laid around 1209, but the construction process was a long one, and while it was partly done by the end of the 1200s, a couple of major earthquakes didn't help, and Pope Clement IV issued a papal bull in 1347, which, nope, still didn't get it finished. And yes, this is the cathedral in Famagusta, now known as the Lala Mustafa Pasha Mosque, built between 1298 to about 1312. Now, since the Kingdom of Cyprus covers nearly 300 years, of which a lot of architecture survives, if we can just take a vertical slice of what was going on the island by taking a look around some of the many ruins of Famagusta, because the sheer variety of churches is quite telling. You have both Catholic and Orthodox churches being built, such as the two churches of St. George, referred to as of the Latins and of the Greeks, respectively, to differentiate them, while the ruins of St. George of the Latins, built around the end of the 1200s, are particularly striking. St. George of the Greeks, dating to around 1300, despite its ruinous state, is quite something, not least because of the height at which it survives. The surviving dome of the apse particularly stands out. We'll get to why there's a load of cannonball damage and a noticeable lack of a roof later. There's the ruined shell of a Franciscan monastery, Just down the road, the twin churches, we're not 100%, but we think they belong to the Templar and Hospitaller orders. And a little further still, the Arminian Church. A little further still, the Armenian Church. A little small and rather overshadowed by the Carmelite Church next door. There's also the Nestorian Church, and if you know what that means, then congratulations, you're either a seminary student or a black belt in church crawling. And the Maronite Church. People seem to agree that the Church of St. Anne looks like an owl. And what could I possibly add to that? And also just a ton more, both in Byzantine and Gothic architectural conventions. It's not to say that Cyprus was some sort of paradise of religious toleration necessarily, but with a mixture of people groups from all around the Eastern Mediterranean, bolstered by a population from the Levant as the Crusader states contracted and fell, there's clearly a melting pot of many Christian traditions converging on the island. Now, when we get to the second half of the 1400s, you end up in a weird political situation on Cyprus. As we get to the penultimate king, as James II of Cyprus, he had married a Venetian, Catherine of Cornaro, which probably one of the most strategic marriages he could have hoped for, with himself having usurped the throne. But Catherine was 14 at the time of their union and didn't travel to Cyprus until 4 years later in 1472. And it must be an absolute and complete coincidence that James II died a few months later after her arrival. There is no chance at all that Venice put out a hit on him. Wink. The timing is not even remotely suspicious. Nor is it slightly suspicious that their child, who would have been James III, also died before his first birthday. Nothing at all to see here. So Catherine remained as the Queen of Cyprus till 1489, during which time Venice had effective control over the island. But eventually, with both the Ottomans and Neapolitans eyeing a takeover, Venice decided to take a more hands-on approach and gave Catherine a huge going-away party to basically sell the island to the Republic. She was definitely not into it, but also essentially had no choice. So all of a sudden, the Republic of Venice had control of a colony a long way from the Rialto, and they seemed acutely aware of just how vulnerable their hold on the island was. Cyprus was easily the furthest flung of all of their holdings, and at a time when the Ottomans had swept through the Balkans and much of the Eastern Mediterranean with a staggering confidence following the fall of Constantinople. You can see from the extent of the Venetian fortifications on the island just how precarious their hold was. And yes, the island was subject to many Ottoman raids during this time. Now, please don't hate, but either this episode clocks in at about an hour and takes 6 months to make, or we outsource the details to some more specific videos, and wouldn't you know it, we are right on the cusp of releasing a bunch of episodes on the Venetian Republic. So a brief tour, and then we'll keep this moving. We've kept teasing Kyrenia, and both the waterfront and the current form of the castle is largely a product of the Venetians. The frankly absurd big walls could only be constructed for the age of gunpowder. It's a beautiful structure. In brief, the huge round towers in the northwest and southeast are the ends of the Venetian upgrades, which were most substantively on the landward side, with this big square bastion in the middle. The harbour layout too, it definitely put me in mind of Hania on Crete. You can see the chain tower here, from which a chain was stretched across the harbour for defence, attached at the other end to this. There's other Venetian details too, like this warehouse. However, the Venetians were, perhaps understandably, a bit selective about where they built vast defensive walls, and quite a few coastal towns of the time, like Larnaca, Limassol and Paphos, were defended with little more than the small fortlets that the Lusignan had built. However, the Venetians did build a network of towers to signal in case of an attack, such as this rather lovely survivor to the west of Larnaca. In the centre of the island, and with its most important cathedral, Nicosia had walls that are simultaneously impressive, but not quite impressive enough. Good in theory, not so much in execution. I mean, they're not very high, and, spoiler alert,
spoilers from history,
Nicosia, through an absolute masterclass of bad leadership, fell within about 40 days of being besieged by the Ottomans. The standout on the island, and the site the Venetian garrison would make their final stand during the Ottoman assault, Famagusta, is an unbelievably well-preserved set of Venetian fortifications. Almost certainly the most complete Venetian fortification system anywhere, and goodness knows, we've seen a few, unsubtle series teaser ahoy. Other than the huge walls and bastions, the fact that they haven't turned the ditch into parking spaces and tennis courts, which is what happens absolutely everywhere else, it's a minor miracle. We will explore them properly soon, I promise, but after holding on against the Ottoman attack for 11 months, Famagusta fell in 1571. This is where the Ottoman period on the island begins, and not to be glib, but characterising this time period is difficult. I mean, sure, no area with a predominantly Christian tradition is likely to enjoy Islamic rule, though I can hear Bosnia loudly clearing its throat, and vice versa. Now, you ask 10 different people, they'll give you 10 different answers. I mean, for starters, the Ottomans are building infrastructure. This aqueduct outside Larnaca is pretty impressive in scale, and there are several pieces of it a couple of kilometres away. It's a major project. Similarly, while it's just a surviving fragment of the Silhatar aqueduct in Nicosia, that was another major undertaking that brought water from the mountains. In Paphos, you can see the remains of 2 sets of baths, a short distance from each other. The first one is just on the perimeter of the Chrysopolitsa Basilica site, and it's a little bit worse for wear. It may have originally been built during the Frankish rule, but then the Ottomans restored the domes. And then just a minute's stroll away, these Ottoman baths at quite an impressive height, although with some ruined sections. And not entirely dissimilarly, though slightly overshadowed by the gorgeously melancholic ruined churches in the town, you can see the Ottoman baths in Famagusta as well. These are the Kafa Pasha baths, built in around 1601. We have quite a number of mosques and minarets surviving. Now, we spent an entire episode looking at how Ottoman architecture in Greece is lucky to have made it into the 21st century, as a lot has been demolished or left to crumble. But on Cyprus, there's still a fair amount of Islamic architecture still visible, and not just in the north. There's the Yami Kabir Mosque in Larnaca, which was formerly a church that was built in the 1500s. Not far away, there's also the Zuhairi Mosque. This was undergoing renovation when we were there. Uncertain foundation date, but we know it was definitely there in the 1600s. I actually deserve a slap on the wrist for this one, because by the lake is the beautiful Halas Sultan Tekke Mosque, which we ended up missing. If you could just cut us some slack for a moment, we had only 3 days in the south to try and cover everything. And whatever you say about us, if you watch the videos on our channel, you definitely can't accuse us of not staying busy. We pack our itineraries as tight as they will go. This one, we just never quite got to, so all I've got is this shaky footage from the car. Sorry, everyone. Around Nicosia, even on the southern side of the line, are several mosques/minarets visible, and almost square in the middle, the Boyak Khan is this beautiful covered marketplace that the Ottomans constructed in 1572, shortly after their conquest. It actually started as a caravanserai, or a type of covered inn, which is more common in the Middle East, and as well as rooms around the outside, it had this mosque in the middle. As already mentioned, across the line in the north, there's the 2 former cathedrals, and in both cases, the Gothic fabric of the buildings was pretty much left as is, with minarets added and some other modifications inside. Something people usually like to forget about the Ottomans: they did largely leave the Christian population free to practice. Across the empire, they seemed to realise that attempting to stamp out the church would compel local populations into a life or death struggle to the last man, whereas having the church where they could keep an eye on it and basically intact as a form of administrational structure for the Christian population was infinitely easier. The status of Cyprus as an Ottoman administrational unit wavered back and forth in ways that are difficult to make sense of unless you're accustomed to the unique practices and terminology of the Ottoman governance. To put all of this in context, the Ottoman period on the island was bookended by atrocities. In the conquering of the island, they went particularly berserk in Nicosia, slaughtering the entire population, with no one left alive except for the enslaved women and children. In Famagusta, after the siege lasting nearly a year, the city was originally surrendered on quite favourable terms for the Venetian defenders, but for reasons that are not entirely clear, Mustafa Pasha suddenly appeared to change his mind and proceeded to not only kill the commander, Marco Antonio Bragadin, in about the most OTT way possible, but also slaughter all of the remaining Christian population in the city. It's pretty grim stuff. Wind forward from the 1500s to the early 1800s, and after the Greek Revolution was announced in 1821, literature was distributed on Cyprus in an attempt to germinate the revolution there too. And the Ottoman governors began executing bishops and hundreds of other Greek Cypriots. By all accounts, the bishops made no attempt at armed resistance, and in the case of Archbishop Kyprianos, declined the offers of asylum by European consuls, even knowing his life was in grave danger. He was hanged on July 9th, with other bishops beheaded soon after. Sadly, history shows us that over and over humans are only too willing to commit appalling massacres, both to expand their empires and maintain their empires. But even though attempts at revolution were brutally suppressed on Cyprus, later in the 1800s, wider geopolitical events would overtake the situation on the island itself. In 1878, in the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, a secretive agreement between the Ottomans and the British, known as the Cyprus Convention, meant the island passed into British administration. Considering its proximity to the British holdings around the Suez Canal, Cyprus had suddenly become a very strategic stepping-off point for the British. It is worth noting that on paper it was still an Ottoman territory the British were administering. But in 1914, when the First World War broke out, the Ottomans declared their allegiance with the Central Powers, and the British promptly declared Cyprus to be part of the British Empire. There were hopes that the British would be sympathetic of the hopes among the Greek-speaking population to be reunited with the Greek state. And this wasn't as implausible as it might sound. The British Empire had donated Corfu and the Ionian Islands to the Greek state in 1864. But no, the British had no intention of giving up their outpost, which served as the guardhouse for the most important sea lane in the empire. Now look, maybe I've played myself here. I keep putting off a larger explanation of the current geopolitical situation on Cyprus, and yet here we are. Video is already sitting at over 20 minutes long, and without doubling the runtime, I don't feel like we can adequately unpick the exact circumstance that brought us to the present state of Cyprus. As we speak, the Cold War channel is going through a pretty much blow-by-blow account of the political situation, a pretty in-depth causality of how and who and when. So for a much wider view on it, you might want to just go and check that out. We're going to try and highlight a bit of the wider context and the events that led directly to the war. So after unrest against British rule in Cyprus, it was declared an independent state in 1960, which is not really what anyone on the island wanted. I mean, insurgency groups like AOKA operated with the goal of uniting Cyprus with Greece. Given both linguistic and cultural ties, it's not all that hard to see why Greek-speaking Cypriots would want union with the Greek state, and for reference, this idea is known as enosis. However, the Greek state between 1967 and 1974 was very different to the current democratic Greek Republic. This was the regime of the colonels, a hard-right military dictatorship. It's not really an exaggeration to call them fascists. They arrested at least 10,000 people in a very short space of time, imprisoned thousands of them, tortured thousands of them, and no shock, suspended just about all the democratic freedoms in the country. And not to spoiler the ending, but the conflict in Cyprus was actually the impetus that upturned that regime on Greece. But given the backdrop of not only increasing tension between the Greek and Turkish communities on the island, but the appalling levels of bloodshed and human suffering that occurred around the population exchanges from Greece and Turkey made following the First World War, history shows us that displacing a population never happens peacefully or without at least one group going through an absolute hell. I mean, wishing your ethnically distinct neighbours away is not a bloodless act. It either leads to a refugee crisis, genocide, or more commonly, both. So the calls from the Turkish community for Taksim, that is the partition of the island, is a little more understandable, and bearing in mind that they were numerically in a minority, I mean the 1960 census putting the Turkish Cypriot population around 18% of the island's residents, this figure has been challenged and may have been slightly higher, but not by much. Finally, while this might seem the most irrelevant part of all, to understand European geopolitics in the second half of the 20th century, in the minds of military leaders and a great many politicians, everything was about the capitalist West versus communism. Things that we would assume had little to nothing to do with the Soviet Union were all viewed through the calculus of, quote, us versus the communists. The Greek military junta we just mentioned was launched on the pretext of preventing a communist plot. I'm going to run out of air quotes before this is done, but all this means that whenever dealing with Cyprus, the issue of what's best for the island came a sort of distant 17th place in the concerns of Western military planners. And while it was clear to any outsider that the years of insurgency and counterinsurgency, with political factions forming around the different ideals for the governance of Cyprus, was all looking rather ominous, the goal was never what was best for Cyprus, but more, how can we maintain an effective bulwark against communism, and how can we prevent two NATO members, that's Greece and Turkey, from going to war over it? So it's a mess. And between a Turkish air raid and uprisings, blood was being spilt, and both communities feeling less and less safe. More and more, they were keen to take up arms to protect their own. And the dam finally broke in 1974 after a military coup launched jointly from Cyprus and the Greek government deposed the Archbishop Makarios, who had been a leader and pivotal figure on Cyprus since independence, but we don't have time to interrogate his various positions and motivations. The military installed Nikos Sampson as president, and he was well known as part of the AOKA B movement and aggressively anti-Turkish. And just 5 days after the overthrow of the Cypriot government, Turkey landed troops on Kyrenia on the morning of July 20th. And if this seems like an overreaction, the very same day, the Turkish enclave in Limassol surrendered to the Cypriot army, this totaling about 10,000 people. And what followed? Not only was the area of the town being burnt, but there were killings and atrocities committed against the men, women and children. The fighting on the island went on for just under a month, and by the time a ceasefire was brokered on the 17th of August, just under 40% of the island was under Turkish control. The subsequent movement of refugees totaled about 160,000 Greek Cypriots and about 60,000 Turkish Cypriots. The UN buffer zone was set up to guard the line between north and south. In 1983, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was declared, angled flag shot, but received no international recognition other than from Turkey. And I don't really want to insert a conclusion here because there hasn't been one. The conflict on Cyprus is often described not as ending, but as being frozen because a peace wasn't really resolved. The fighting stopped, but in a manner that's not particularly satisfactory to anyone. As we mentioned in the episode, Northern Cyprus today is a pretty modern and relaxed place to live, all things considered, and the Republic of Cyprus has clearly done well. But what do you want from me? You want me to suggest what the answer is? Get out of here. What do I know? We've spent about the last 100 years trying to figure out how to have a peaceful Cyprus, and we're still not there. Having seen both communities, I'm optimistic it can be achieved socially. Politically, that remains to be seen. I'll be honest, I discovered as I was making these 2 episodes on Cyprus, I really don't enjoy making videos this broad that cover as much time as we have. Whenever I see summary videos on YouTube, I'm usually left with so many questions, it's frustrating not to be able to dig more substantively into different periods. But if this particular wide-angle view from the Romans to the current Republic offers us one thing, there are curious echoes. I mean, the way in which Cyprus time and time again has been influenced by European powers far to its west, and above all, the fact that a power-sharing agreement between the then Islamic forces and Byzantine Christian powers managed to hold for 3 of the most turbulent centuries in the Western Mediterranean. I mean, that has to give us some hope for peace and stability on Cyprus. Anyway, the other reason I don't like this sort of episode is the amount of time it takes to write and research, and knowing that the comments section is probably going to need its own UN buffer zone to stop people from starting fights. So, next episode, something far less contentious. I mean, it's not like there have been any modern conflicts in Croatia. That was a joke, people. Pipe down. But yes, a series that probably should have started in 2020 on the Croatian Adriatic coast is finally getting made, so stick around for that. And look, be nice to people in the comments below. Find the music you've been hearing in these episodes on bandcamp.com and support us there. A follow on Twitter and Instagram would go a long way, and, well, then again, at time of writing, we're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and it's only taken the entire lifespan of this channel to get to 4 figures. So look, help us out. Hit a bell and a subscribe, and we'll see you all very soon.